I'm Officer Marcus Chen, and I've been patrolling the Cascade foothills for 8 years now. I've seen plenty of weird things up in these mountains: abandoned campsites with food still warm on the fire, hikers who swear they've been walking for days when they've only been gone for hours. But nothing prepared me for what we found at mile marker 97 on Highway 409. It started in late October of 2023. Dispatch called me about an abandoned vehicle on the shoulder. Nothing unusual there. People break down all the time on that winding stretch between Cedar Falls and Mount Baker. The road cuts through dense forest for miles, cell service is spotty, and it gets dark early up there. I figured someone had engine trouble and caught a ride to town. But when I pulled up behind the white Honda Accord at mile marker 97, something felt wrong immediately. The car was positioned too perfectly on the shoulder, like someone had used a ruler to align it with the yellow line. The hazard lights were blinking in slow, deliberate rhythm. When I approached the driver's side, I could see the keys still dangling from the ignition, the radio crackling with static. I ran the plates. The car belonged to Janet Morrison, a 62-year-old teacher from Bellingham. According to her family, she'd been missing for 3 weeks. They'd filed a report, but searches of her usual routes had turned up nothing. Now, here was her car, sitting pristine on a road she had no reason to travel. The interior was immaculate. No signs of struggle, no personal items scattered around. But the radio bothered me. It was tuned to 88.7 FM, a frequency that should have been broadcasting classic rock from the Valley Station. Instead, it was playing dead air, not silence, but that particular static that sounds like breathing. I called it in and waited for the tow truck. While I sat in my patrol car filling out paperwork, I started hearing things through my own radio. Fragments of conversation, distorted and faint. At first, I thought it was cross-chatter from other departments, but the voices didn't sound like cops or dispatchers. They sounded scared. "Don't know where I am," came through clearly. A woman's voice. "The road just keeps going and going." I turned up the volume, but the transmission cut to static. Then, clearer than before, "Hello? Can anyone hear me? My name is Janet Morrison, and I think I'm lost." My blood went cold. I was hearing the missing woman's voice, but the transmission was coming through my radio, not hers. I tried to respond, keying my mic and asking for her location, but I only got dead air in return. The tow truck arrived 20 minutes later. As they loaded the Honda onto the flatbed, I noticed something else strange. There were no tire tracks leading to where the car sat, no disturbance in the gravel shoulder. It was as if the vehicle had simply appeared there. I thought that would be the end of it, but 2 weeks later, dispatch sent me back to the same spot. Another abandoned car, another missing person. This time, it was a blue Toyota belonging to David Reeves, a salesman from Seattle who'd vanished a month prior. Same positioning, same perfect alignment with the road, same radio frequency, playing static. And again, while I waited for the tow truck, voices came through my patrol radio. David's voice this time, calling for help, saying he was driving in circles and couldn't find his way out of the mountains. The transmissions lasted exactly 12 minutes, then cut to silence. I started doing research. Mile marker 97 sits at the base of Dead Man's Ridge, named for a logging accident in 1958 that killed 6 workers. The Forest Service had tried to build a lookout tower there in the 70s, but construction crews reported equipment malfunctions and strange radio interference. They eventually abandoned the project. Local records showed a pattern going back decades. Cars found abandoned at that exact spot, always in perfect condition, always with missing drivers. The county had stopped investigating after a while, treating them as simple abandonment cases. But I started mapping the disappearances, and the timeline was unsettling. Every few months, like clockwork, always at mile marker 97, always with the radio tuned to 88.7. I mentioned it to Pete Kowalski, the veteran officer who'd been working these mountains for 20 years. His face went gray when I brought up the location. "I used to patrol that stretch," he said. Had to stop. Too many weird calls. Too many people claiming they heard voices on their car radios. Department brass said I was getting spooked by forest acoustics and wildlife sounds. But you heard them too, I said. He was quiet for a long time. Finally, he nodded. The voices are always the same people. The ones who went missing. Like they're still out there somewhere. Still driving. Still calling for help. The third car appeared in January. A red Subaru belonging to Lisa Park, a nurse who'd been missing for 6 weeks. By now, I knew the routine. Perfect positioning. Keys in ignition. Radio on 88.7. But this time, I brought equipment. A digital recorder. A spectrum analyzer I'd borrowed from a friend who worked in radio. As I waited alone in the growing darkness, the voices started again. Lisa's voice, frightened and confused, reporting that her GPS wasn't working and the road signs didn't make sense. But according to my analyzer, the transmission wasn't coming from any radio source. It was emanating from the road itself, from somewhere beneath the asphalt. I decided to stay overnight, parking my patrol car a quarter mile up the highway with a clear view of mile marker 97. Around 3 a.m., I saw headlights approaching from the north. A dark sedan, driving slowly, hazard lights blinking. As I watched through binoculars, the car pulled onto the shoulder at the exact spot where the others had been found. I drove down to investigate, but when I reached the marker, the road was empty. No car, no tire tracks, nothing. But my radio was crackling with a new voice, male and panicked. This is impossible. I've been driving for hours, but I keep ending up in the same place. The mile markers aren't making sense. It's like the road is folding back on itself. I recognized the voice from missing person reports. Thomas Walsh, a contractor who disappeared 3 days earlier. The next morning, his silver Ford was there, positioned perfectly on the shoulder, keys in ignition, radio tuned to 88.7. I started bringing other officers with me on calls to mile marker 97, but they never heard the voices. To them, it was just static. They'd find reasonable explanations, animals in the forest, wind through the trees, atmospheric interference. But I knew what I was hearing. The missing people were still out there, still driving, trapped in some version of Highway 409 that existed parallel to our own. And every few months, their cars appeared at mile marker 97, like messages in bottles washing up on a shore. I've stopped patrolling that section of highway, requested reassignment to the valley routes, told my supervisor I needed a change of scenery. But sometimes, late at night when I'm driving home, I tune my radio to 88.7 and listen to the static. Last week, I heard something new, a familiar voice cutting through the white noise. Officer Chen? Can you hear me? I think I took a wrong turn somewhere. The GPS says I'm on Highway 409, but nothing looks right. Can you send someone to mile marker 97? It was my own voice, scared and confused, calling for help from a road I've never driven as anything but a cop. I haven't been back to check if my patrol car is sitting there on the shoulder, perfectly aligned, keys in ignition, radio tuned to dead air that breathes. I'm Detective Sarah Whitmore, and I've been working cases in central Pennsylvania for 15 years. Most of my investigations involve straightforward crimes, domestic disputes, theft, the occasional drug bust. But in November of 2024, I got assigned to something that still keeps me awake at night. The call came in from Centralia, or what's left of it. Most people know the story, the underground coal fire that's been burning since 1962, forcing almost everyone to abandon the town. These days, maybe 10 people still live there, stubborn holdouts who refuse to leave despite the toxic gases seeping up through their basements. The fire is expected to burn for another 250 years. But this wasn't about the fire. A group of paranormal investigators called the Allegheny Research Collective had been conducting studies in one of the few remaining houses on Locust Avenue. The Victorian had somehow survived decades of underground burning, standing alone on a block where most structures had been demolished or consumed by subsidence. The investigators had gone missing after setting up extensive recording equipment throughout the house. Their rental car was found in the driveway, keys inside, personal belongings untouched. The group consisted of Dr. Raymond Fuller, a psychology professor from Penn State, his graduate student Lisa Chen, and two experienced ghost hunters, Michael Torres and Amanda Price. They'd been documenting paranormal activity in the house for 3 weeks before vanishing without a trace. When I arrived in Centralia, the silence was overwhelming. No traffic, no construction noise, just the occasional hiss of steam rising from cracks in the pavement where the underground fire heated the ground. The air smelled of sulfur and burnt coal. Street signs marked roads that no longer existed, leading to empty lots where houses once stood. The Victorian on Locust Avenue looked like something from a different century, which technically it was. Built in 1893, it was a 3-story structure with ornate gingerbread trim and a wraparound porch. Despite decades of abandonment and the toxic environment, it appeared remarkably well preserved. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the investigators had left behind thousands of dollars worth of equipment. Digital audio recorders in every room, electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, and computer terminals displaying waveform analysis software. Everything was still running, powered by a generator in the basement. But what caught my attention immediately were the voices. Soft conversation was coming from speakers throughout the house. At first, I assumed it was the investigators' own recordings playing back. But as I listened more carefully, I realized the voices were too varied, spanning different accents and speech patterns from multiple time periods. In the parlor, I could hear what sounded like a woman from the 1930s discussing her husband's work at the mine. In the kitchen, children's voices from perhaps the 1950s argued over whose turn it was to feed the chickens. I found Dr. Fuller's research notes scattered across a desk in the front bedroom. His handwriting grew increasingly agitated over the course of several pages. Early entries described standard paranormal investigation techniques and baseline readings, but later notes revealed something unprecedented. The house appears to be functioning as an acoustic repository, he'd written. Every conversation, every sound that has occurred within these walls over the past 130 years is being preserved and played back in chronological sequence. We've documented voices from at least 6 different decades, all corresponding to known residents of the property. But that wasn't the disturbing part. According to Fuller's final entry, dated 3 days before the group disappeared, the house had started playing back conversations that hadn't happened yet. Lisa heard her own voice this morning, coming from the second-floor hallway, the note continued. She was discussing our findings with someone named Detective Whitmore, describing events that occurred today, but we haven't spoken to any Detective Whitmore. The conversation referenced our disappearance in past tense, as if it had already happened. I felt ice in my veins as I read my own name in his handwriting. According to the timestamp on the recording equipment, Lisa Chen's voice should be audible in the upstairs hallway at exactly 3:47 p.m. I checked my watch. 3:38. I climbed the creaking stairs, following the sound of my own footsteps echoing from speakers hidden throughout the house. The hallway was narrow, lined with closed doors, leading to bedrooms that probably hadn't been occupied in decades. As I reached the landing, I heard a woman's voice, clear and distinct, coming from the speaker mounted near the ceiling. Detective Whitmore, you need to understand what we discovered here. The house isn't just recording conversations, it's recording all possible conversations. Every word that could be spoken within these walls, across all timelines, all potential realities. It was Lisa Chen's voice, but she was speaking to me, responding to questions I hadn't asked yet. I felt compelled to respond, as if I was participating in a conversation that was somehow predetermined. What happened to Dr. Fuller? I heard myself ask aloud. The response came immediately through the speakers. He's still here. They're all still here. The house collected them, just like it collects every sound, every word, every breath. Once you've contributed enough to its archive, it won't let you leave. I tried to rationalize what I was experiencing. Perhaps the investigators had staged this elaborate hoax, hiding somewhere in the house and playing back pre-recorded responses to likely questions. But as I explored the upper floors, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding place, I found no trace of them. In the master bedroom, the recording equipment showed active input from microphones placed throughout the house. The waveform displays indicated constant audio activity, picking up conversations in languages I couldn't identify, and voices that seemed to span centuries. Some sounded like Native American languages, possibly from before European settlement. Others were clearly from the coal mining era, discussing work shifts and family concerns in the heavy accents of Irish and Polish immigrants. But interspersed with these historical recordings were voices from the future. A child talking about flying cars, a woman discussing medicines for diseases that didn't exist yet, a man describing the day the underground fire finally went out, sometime in the 23rd century. As afternoon faded into evening, I realized I'd been in the house for over 4 hours. Time seemed elastic here, stretching and compressing in ways that defied logic. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. The outside world felt increasingly distant, while the voices in the walls grew more insistent. I heard my own voice again, this time from the parlor speakers. I know I should leave, but I can't. There's something here that needs to be understood. The investigators didn't disappear, they became part of the archive. Their voices, their knowledge, their final moments, all preserved forever. That's when I realized the truth, that Dr. Fuller had discovered too late. The house wasn't just recording random conversations. It was collecting human consciousness itself, preserving every thought, every emotion, every experience within its walls. The underground fire hadn't destroyed this place. It had transformed it into something that existed outside normal time, a repository for all human experience, past and future. I ran for the front door, but as my hand touched the handle, I heard my own voice coming from speakers in the foyer. I tried to leave, but the house had already recorded my decision to stay. Every choice I might make, it had already documented. Every word I might speak, every thought I might think, was already part of its collection. The door wouldn't open, or perhaps I couldn't make myself turn the handle. The boundary between my will and the house's influence had become impossible to define. I'm still here now, adding my voice to the archive. Sometimes I hear Detective Rodriguez calling my name from outside, probably wondering why my car is still in the driveway. Sometimes I hear my own voice answering questions about this case, spoken to investigators who haven't arrived yet. The house records everything, every word, every silence, every possibility. And once you've contributed enough to its collection, it never lets you go. I understand now why Centralia was really abandoned. It wasn't the fire that drove people away. It was the realization that some places remember too much. I'm Ranger Tom Valdez, and I've been working at Crater Lake National Park for 11 years. In all that time, I thought I'd seen everything: hypothermia cases, bear encounters, the occasional tourist who tried to climb down to the lake despite the 1,000-foot cliffs. But nothing prepared me for what started happening in the summer of 2024. The park covers 183,000 acres of pristine wilderness in southern Oregon, centered around the deepest lake in the United States. Crater Lake sits in the caldera of an ancient volcano, surrounded by cliffs that rise nearly 2,000 feet above the cobalt blue water. Most visitors stick to the rim drive, taking pictures at the overlooks and visitor center. The serious hikers venture onto the backcountry trails that wind through old-growth forest and alpine meadows. I work primarily on the east side of the park, patrolling the more remote areas where cell service is non-existent and help can be hours away. It's demanding work, but I've always found peace in the solitude. The forest has its own rhythm, its own sense of time that moves differently than the world outside. The first incident report came in on July 15th. A family of 4 from Portland had been hiking the Mount Scott Trail, a moderate 6-mile round trip that offers spectacular views of the lake. According to their statement, they'd started the hike at 10 a.m. and expected to be back at their car by 2 in the afternoon. Instead, they found themselves standing in the parking lot at 4:38 p.m. with no memory of the past several hours. Officer Rebecca Mills from the County Sheriff's Department took the initial report. She's worked with the Park Service on search and rescue operations for years, and we've developed a good working relationship. When she called to discuss the case, I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "The thing is, Tom, they're not acting like typical lost hikers," she said. "No signs of dehydration or exhaustion, no confusion about where they've been, just a complete blank where those hours should be. And their GPS data is strange." The family's hiking GPS unit had recorded their movements throughout the day, but the track showed impossible patterns during the missing time period. According to the device, they'd somehow traveled over 15 miles through terrain that doesn't exist, visiting coordinates that placed them in the middle of Crater Lake itself, 900 feet below the surface. I assumed it was a GPS malfunction. The volcanic rock around the caldera can interfere with satellite signals, and I'd seen devices give false readings before. But when the second incident occurred 3 days later, I started paying closer attention. This time it was a group of experienced backpackers from California, all seasoned hikers with professional-grade equipment. They'd been following the Pacific Crest Trail section that runs through the park when they experienced the same phenomenon, a gap of exactly 58 minutes, where their memory simply stopped. Their GPS tracks showed similar impossible movements, placing them underwater in the lake during the missing time. But what disturbed me most was what they remembered afterward. Despite having no conscious recollection of those missing minutes, they could describe in perfect detail a section of backcountry trail they'd never seen before. The Boundary Springs area, which was over 20 miles from where they'd been hiking. They knew the exact placement of fallen logs, the species of wildflowers in the meadows, even the sound the water made as it flowed over specific rock formations. Rebecca and I decided to investigate together. We equipped ourselves with multiple GPS units, backup batteries, and agreed to maintain radio contact every 15 minutes. The plan was to hike the Mount Scott Trail during peak hours, when the incident seemed most likely to occur. The morning was perfect, clear skies, temperature in the mid-70s, excellent visibility across the caldera. We started up the trail at 9:45 a.m., following the switchbacks through mountain hemlock and Shasta red fir. The forest was unusually quiet. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even our own footsteps seemed muffled, as if the sound was being absorbed by something unseen. About halfway up the trail, Rebecca stopped walking. "Tom, check your watch," she said, her voice tight with concern. I looked down at my wrist. The digital display read 12:43 p.m. But according to my internal sense of time, we'd been hiking for maybe an hour. The sun's position in the sky supported that estimation. It should have been around 11 a.m. "That's not right," I said, checking my backup watch. It showed the same time. We couldn't have been walking for 3 hours. We haven't even reached the summit yet. Rebecca was studying her GPS unit, her face growing pale. "Tom, look at this. The track shows us covering 8 miles in the past hour. But look at our actual position." According to the GPS, we were standing exactly where we should be on the Mount Scott Trail, about 3 miles from the trailhead. But the tracking data showed we'd somehow traveled in a complex loop that took us down to the lakeshore, along paths that didn't exist, and through areas that were geologically impossible to reach. More disturbing was what I was beginning to remember, or think I remembered. Fragments of images, like trying to recall a dream after waking. standing on a beach beside Crater Lake, even though there are no beaches accessible from the rim. Walking through a forest of trees I'd never seen before, with bark that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at it. The sound of voices speaking in a language that felt familiar, but that I couldn't identify. We continued to the summit, both of us increasingly unsettled by what we'd experienced. From the top of Mount Scott, the entire caldera spread out below us. The impossibly blue water, the sheer cliffs, the phantom ship island jutting up from the depths. It was a view I'd seen hundreds of times, but something felt different. The proportions seemed wrong, as if the lake was both closer and farther away than it should be. "Do you see that?" Rebecca asked, pointing toward the far shore. I followed her gaze but saw only the usual landscape: forest, cliffs, and water. "See what?" "There are people down there. On the shore. I can see them walking around, but that's impossible. There's no way to get down there from this side of the rim." I borrowed her binoculars and scanned the area she'd indicated. For just a moment, I thought I saw movement, tiny figures walking along what looked like a narrow beach. But when I adjusted the focus, there was nothing there but the steep volcanic walls dropping straight into the water. The hike back to the parking lot should have taken 90 minutes. Instead, we found ourselves standing beside our vehicles at 6:15 p.m. with no clear memory of the descent. Our GPS units showed we'd covered impossible distances again, visiting locations throughout the park that would have required days of hiking to reach. But the most unsettling part was what we both remembered from that missing time: detailed knowledge of places we'd never been, hidden caves behind waterfalls that weren't marked on any map, a meadow full of flowers that bloom in September even though it was still July. The feeling that we'd been walking for hours through a version of Crater Lake that existed alongside our own, but followed different rules. Over the following weeks, the incidents continued. Always the same 58-minute gap. Always the impossible GPS tracks, placing people underwater or in inaccessible areas. Always the afterward memories of places that shouldn't exist. Rebecca and I documented everything, but our reports were filed away without explanation. The Park Service preferred to classify them as equipment malfunctions and altitude-related confusion. I've stopped hiking the backcountry trails during peak hours, not because I'm afraid of what happens during those missing minutes, but because I'm afraid of what I might remember afterward. Sometimes I catch myself with knowledge I shouldn't have: the location of a ranger station that was never built, trails that lead to viewpoints that don't appear on any map, the sound of voices calling my name from the depths of the lake. The forest around Crater Lake keeps its own time, and sometimes it invites us to step outside ours. Those 58 minutes aren't missing, they're spent somewhere else, walking through a landscape that exists in the spaces between seconds, where the caldera holds more than just water. I still work at the park, but I've learned not to trust my watch too much. Time moves differently here, and some hours belong to the lake itself. I'm Deputy James Morrison, and I've been working law enforcement in the Texas Panhandle for 13 years. Most of my calls involve routine issues: domestic disputes in Amarillo, traffic accidents on Interstate 27, the occasional cattle rustling case that makes me feel like I'm living in the Old West. But in September of 2024, I started getting reports from Palo Duro Canyon State Park that didn't fit any category I'd encountered before. Palo Duro is the second largest canyon in the United States, 120 miles long and as much as 20 miles wide in some places. The locals call it the Grand Canyon of Texas, though it's nothing like its more famous cousin in Arizona. Where the Grand Canyon is all stark rock and dramatic vistas, Palo Duro is painted in layers of red, orange, and yellow stone that shift color with the light. Cottonwood trees line the canyon floor along the Prairie Dog Town fork of the Red River, and the whole landscape feels ancient in a way that makes you speak in whispers. The park draws photographers from across the country, especially during golden hour, when the canyon walls seem to glow from within. Most visitors stick to the overlooks and established trails, but serious photographers often venture into the backcountry to capture angles that haven't been shot 1,000 times before. It was these photographers who started reporting something unusual. The first complaint came from Elena Rodriguez, a nature photographer from Dallas who'd been shooting sunrise at the Lighthouse Rock Formation. She'd been reviewing her images that evening when she noticed something that hadn't been visible when she was taking the shots. In the background of several photos, standing on a ridge about half a mile away, was the silhouette of a human figure. "I spent 3 hours at that location," she told me when I took her statement. "I had binoculars. I was scanning the area constantly for composition opportunities. There was nobody else out there. But this figure shows up clear as day in my photos, just standing perfectly still on the ridge." I assumed she'd simply missed seeing another hiker in the distance. The canyon is vast, and it's easy to overlook details when you're focused on framing a shot. But Elena insisted she'd been vigilant about checking for other people, both for safety reasons and because she didn't want them in her photographs. What made the report more interesting was what happened next. 2 days after she noticed the figure in her photos, Elena started receiving phone calls from a number that didn't exist. When she answered, she heard only breathing, but it was her own breathing, recorded from when she'd been hiking in the canyon. The sound of her exertion as she'd climbed to her shooting location, her quiet exclamations of wonder when she'd seen the sunrise lighting the rock formations. I might have dismissed this as coincidence or an elaborate prank, but similar reports started coming in from other photographers. Always the same pattern: figures visible in photos, but not to the naked eye, followed by mysterious phone calls, playing back their own recorded voices and breathing from their time in the canyon. The second photographer was David Kim, a professional landscape artist from Houston. He'd been shooting at the Spanish Skirts Formation when he captured what he described as an entire crowd of motionless figures standing along various ridgelines throughout the canyon. Like Elena, he swore he'd seen nobody else during his 6-hour shoot, but his images showed dozens of human silhouettes, all perfectly still, all positioned as if they were watching him work. David's phone calls started the next day, but instead of just his breathing, he heard his own voice providing a running commentary on his photography session observations he'd made to himself while shooting, technical notes about camera settings, even his quiet cursing when he dropped a lens filter, all recorded somehow and played back by callers from numbers that, when traced, led to disconnected lines that had never been in service. I decided to investigate personally. I'm not a photographer, but I borrowed a decent camera from the evidence locker, a Canon that had been confiscated in an unrelated case, and headed out to Palo Duro on a clear October morning. I chose the Lighthouse Trail, figuring if there was something to see, I'd have the best vantage point from the park's most famous landmark. The hike to Lighthouse Rock is relatively easy, a 3-mile round trip through classic Texas canyon country. The trail winds between towering mesas and through groves of cottonwoods and mesquite, eventually leading to the base of the sandstone pillar that gives the formation its name. I'd walked this trail dozens of times over the years, but never with the feeling that I was being observed. That morning, the sensation was unmistakable. As I hiked, I kept turning to check the ridgelines around me, expecting to see other hikers or park rangers. The canyon was empty as far as I could tell, but the feeling of being watched never left. It reminded me of tracking suspects through urban environments, that prickling awareness that eyes were on you, even when you couldn't identify the source. I reached the Lighthouse Formation around 9 a.m. and started taking pictures. I'm no artist, but I tried to capture the same types of shots that Elena and David had been working on: wide vistas showing the layered canyon walls, close-ups of the rock formations, panoramic views from different angles. Through the camera viewfinder, everything looked normal. Just empty canyon, spectacular geology, and morning light painting the stones in shades of rust and gold. It wasn't until I got home and uploaded the images to my computer that I understood what the photographers had been reporting. In nearly every shot, scattered across various ridges and outcroppings throughout the canyon, were human figures. They appeared as dark silhouettes against the lighter stone, perfectly motionless, always positioned as if they were facing toward my location. But what disturbed me most was how many there were. Elena had captured one figure in her photos. David had seen dozens. In my images, I counted over 60 distinct silhouettes, spread across miles of canyon landscape. Some were standing alone on prominent ridges, others were grouped together in clusters of 3 or 4. All were too distant to make out details, but their posture and positioning suggested they were human. The phone calls started that evening. The first came at 8:37 p.m. from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, I heard my own voice from earlier that day. Jesus, this place is beautiful. No wonder people come from all over to photograph it. I remembered making that comment to myself while hiking, but I was certain I'd been alone on the trail. Over the following days, the calls continued, always from different numbers, always playing back audio from my time in the canyon. My footsteps on the trail, my heavy breathing during the steeper sections, even the sound of me adjusting the camera settings. Whoever or whatever was calling had somehow recorded my entire hiking experience from multiple angles, capturing sounds and conversations I'd had only with myself. I returned to Palo Duro a week later, this time with backup. Ranger Patricia Hoffman had worked the park for over 20 years and knew every trail, every formation, every hiding spot where someone might position themselves to watch visitors. We hiked together to several of the locations where photographers had reported the highest concentrations of figures in their images. I've seen a lot of strange things in this canyon, Patricia told me as we climbed toward the Capitol Peak overlook. Lights that don't correspond to any known source, sounds that carry farther than they should, areas where your compass spins like it can't find magnetic north. But I've never seen anything like what you're describing. We spent the entire day photographing from different vantage points throughout the park. Patricia used her own camera, while I continued with the evidence locker Canon. We maintained constant communication, checking in with each other every few minutes, and carefully documenting our locations and the time each photo was taken. That evening, as we reviewed our images, the pattern became clear and terrifying. Not only did both our cameras capture the mysterious figures, but the number had grown exponentially. Where I'd photographed 60 silhouettes the previous week, our combined images now showed over 200 distinct figures positioned throughout the canyon. They covered nearly every visible ridge, outcropping, and elevated position within our field of view. More disturbing was their apparent awareness of our presence. In Patricia's photos, figures that had been facing east in my earlier images had turned to face our new position. Some appeared to have moved closer, relocating from distant ridges to positions that would provide better views of our activities. It was as if they were tracking our movements and adjusting their own positions accordingly. The phone calls that followed were different this time. Instead of just playing back our recorded conversations, the callers began to interact. When Patricia's phone rang and she answered, she heard her own voice asking questions she hadn't spoken aloud. How long have they been watching us? What do they want? Are we safe out here? My calls became stranger still. I would hear my own voice providing detailed information about canyon geology and history that I definitely didn't know. Technical explanations about rock formations, Native American legends about the area, historical accounts of early settlers, all delivered in my own voice, as if I'd somehow become an expert on subjects I'd never studied. We tried to rationalize what we were experiencing. Equipment malfunctions, elaborate pranks by tech-savvy locals, some kind of acoustic phenomenon unique to the canyon's geology. But deep down, we both knew we were dealing with something that defied conventional explanation. I've stopped visiting Palo Duro Canyon. Patricia has requested a transfer to a different state park. The official reports we filed described the incidents as unexplained photographic anomalies and possible prank calls. But we both know the truth is more unsettling. The figures in the photographs aren't random glitches or shadows. They're watching, waiting, learning. With each visitor who photographs the canyon, their numbers grow and their knowledge expands. They collect our voices, our movements, our thoughts, building some kind of archive of human presence in that ancient landscape. Sometimes, late at night, my phone still rings with calls from numbers that don't exist. But now I hear other voices too. Elena's, David's, Patricia's, all mixed together, discussing things we never said, about places we've never been. The canyon's watchers are building something with our collected experiences, and I don't think we're supposed to understand what it is. I just know that some places see more than they should, and Palo Duro Canyon never stops watching. I'm Officer Diana Foster, and I've been working missing persons cases for the New Jersey State Police for 9 years. Most of my work involves following paper trails, cell phone records, credit card transactions, witness interviews that lead nowhere. It's methodical, often heartbreaking work, but it follows predictable patterns. People disappear for reasons that make sense, even when those reasons are tragic. But in October of 2024, I encountered something that challenged everything I thought I knew about how information travels. The Pine Barrens cover over 1 million acres of southern New Jersey, a vast wilderness of sandy soil, cedar swamps, and scrub oak that most people drive through without really seeing. It's one of the last truly wild places on the East Coast, home to legends about the Jersey Devil and stories of people who vanished into the forest and were never found. I'd worked several missing persons cases in the Barrens over the years, and they were always the most difficult. The forest swallows evidence, covers tracks, and keeps its secrets well. My caseload at the time included 3 active disappearances in the Pine Barrens area. Kevin Walsh, a 34-year-old teacher from Camden who'd gone hiking alone in Wharton State Forest 6 weeks earlier. Maria Santos, a college student from Rutgers who'd been camping with friends near Botstow Village and had wandered away from their campsite during the night. And Robert Chen, a retiree from Philadelphia who'd been driving through the Barrens on back roads and whose car had been found abandoned on a dirt trail with no signs of where he'd gone. None of the cases had generated significant leads. The families were growing desperate, the media attention was fading, and my supervisor was starting to suggest that we might need to scale back active investigation and wait for hunters or hikers to stumble across remains. It's a conversation no detective wants to have, but resources are limited and new cases keep coming in. That's when I started hearing about the radio station. The first report came from Margaret Walsh, Kevin's mother. She'd been driving through the Pine Barrens, following routes her son might have taken, when she'd picked up a signal on AM radio that wasn't listed on any frequency guide. The voice was male, calm and professional, reading what sounded like news updates about missing persons cases. But the information was wrong, or at least it was information that hadn't been released to the public. They knew about Kevin's backpack, she told me during our interview. They described the exact brand, the color, even the fact that he'd sewn a patch from Yellowstone on the front pocket. But I never told the police about that patch. I never told anyone. I assumed she'd forgotten mentioning the detail during one of our earlier interviews, or that someone in the family had shared the information with a local news station. But when I reviewed my notes and listened to the recorded interviews, there was no mention of any patches or specific details about Kevin's backpack. Maria Santos's father called me 2 days later with a similar story. He'd been driving home from another fruitless search of the camping area when he'd tuned into the same station. This time, the broadcast had included details about Maria's last known activities that we'd never shared with the family-specific conversations she'd had with her camping companions, the exact time she'd left the campsite, Even the fact that she'd taken her cell phone but left her wallet behind. How would anyone outside the investigation know these things? He asked me. We never talked to any reporters about the details of that night. I decided to try finding the station myself. I drove Route 543 through the heart of the Barrens, scanning through AM frequencies while taking notes on signal strength and location. For the first 2 hours, I picked up nothing unusual, just the standard mix of talk radio, religious programming, and distant stations bleeding in from Philadelphia and New York. Then, around mile marker 37, I found it. The signal was weak and filled with static, but the voice was clear enough to understand. A man speaking in measured tones, as if reading from prepared notes. Kevin Walsh was last seen at approximately 2:15 p.m. on September 8th, wearing a blue North Face backpack with a Yellowstone National Park patch attached to the front pocket. His planned route included the Batona Trail section between Atzion and Goshen Pond, but GPS data from his phone suggests he deviated from this path around mile marker 7.3. I pulled over and turned up the volume. The broadcaster continued. Mr. Walsh's remains will be located approximately 800 meters southeast of the old Cranberry Bog access road, in a depression partially concealed by fallen pine trees. Recovery teams should focus their search on grid coordinates 41.738 north, 74.629 west. I wrote down the coordinates, my hands shaking as I realized what I was hearing. This wasn't just inside information about the case, it was a prediction about where Kevin Walsh's body would be found. The broadcaster was providing specific location data that we didn't have, delivered as if it was established fact rather than speculation. The signal faded as I drove further south, but I'd heard enough to know I needed to investigate those coordinates. I called in a search team and guided them to the location specified in the broadcast. We found Kevin Walsh's remains exactly where the radio station had predicted, in a depression near the Cranberry Bog access road, partially hidden by fallen trees. The discovery should have felt like a victory, but instead it filled me with dread. How had an unlicensed radio station known the precise location of a body that trained search teams had been unable to find for 6 weeks? I reported the incident to the Federal Communications Commission, requesting an investigation into the unauthorized broadcast. The FCC traced the signal to coordinates deep in the Pine Barrens, but when agents visited the location, they found only empty forest. No transmission equipment, no power sources, no evidence that any kind of broadcasting facility had ever been installed there. But the station continued to broadcast. Over the following weeks, I made regular drives through the Barrens, always scanning for that elusive signal. I heard updates on Maria Santos's case that proved equally accurate details about her movements the night she disappeared, descriptions of evidence we hadn't found yet, and eventually, coordinates for her location that led us directly to her remains in a remote section of Cedar Swamp. The broadcasts about Robert Chen were the most disturbing. The station provided not just information about where he could be found, but a detailed account of his final hours, how he'd gotten lost on the dirt roads, how his car had overheated, how he'd decided to walk for help and had become disoriented in the dense forest. The broadcast described his growing panic, his failed attempts to find his way back to the road, and eventually his collapse from exhaustion and dehydration near a small pond that didn't appear on any official maps. When we found Robert's body, everything the radio station had described was exactly as we discovered it. His position relative to the unmarked pond, the direction he'd been walking when he fell, even the contents of his pockets, all precisely matched the broadcast description. I became obsessed with finding the source of these transmissions. I requisitioned more sophisticated radio direction finding equipment and spent my off-duty hours driving through the Pine Barrens with signal analyzers and GPS units. Every attempt to triangulate the broadcast origin led to the same conclusion. The signal was coming from coordinates that contained nothing but trees and sandy soil. The most unsettling broadcast came on a cold November evening. I was parked at a rest area on Route 706, listening to another update on a new missing persons case from Atlantic County when the station's usual programming was interrupted by something different. "Officer Diana Foster," the familiar voice said, addressing me directly. "You've been listening to our broadcasts for several weeks now. You understand that we provide accurate information about cases that fall within our area of responsibility." I felt ice in my chest as the voice continued. "There is one more case that requires your attention. A missing person who has not yet been reported missing, but will be within the next 72 hours. The individual is currently lost in the Pine Barrens, approximately 2.4 miles northeast of your current location." The broadcaster provided detailed coordinates and a description of a hiker who had become separated from a group earlier that day. According to the transmission, the person was injured but alive, and would remain so for approximately 18 hours before succumbing to exposure. I radioed for backup and organized an immediate search of the coordinates the station had provided. We found the hiker exactly as described, a 26-year-old man from Newark who had indeed become separated from his hiking group. He was hypothermic and had a twisted ankle, but he was alive. He told us he'd been lost for about 6 hours and had given up hope of being found before morning. That rescue should have felt like a triumph, but instead it terrified me. The radio station wasn't just reporting on missing persons cases, it was somehow aware of people who were lost before anyone else knew they were missing. It was monitoring the Pine Barrens in ways that defied explanation, collecting information from sources that shouldn't exist. I tried to trace the station's knowledge by analyzing the timing of its broadcasts relative to when people actually went missing. The pattern was consistent and impossible. The station always knew about disappearances before they were reported, sometimes before the missing persons themselves realized they were in trouble. The final broadcast I heard was the most personal. I was driving home late one evening, exhausted after another fruitless day of trying to locate the transmission source, when the station came through clearly on the radio. "Officer Diana Foster," the voice said. "You have been investigating our broadcasts for 6 weeks now. Your efforts to locate our transmission facility will be unsuccessful because you are looking for something that exists in a different relationship to physical space than you understand." The voice paused, and I could hear something that might have been breathing, or whine through trees, or the whisper of radio static. "Your investigation ends tomorrow at 3:27 a.m., when you will receive a call reporting that you have been missing for 4 days. The search teams will find your patrol car parked at coordinates 39.682, north 74.551, west, but they will not find you for another week." I pulled over, my hands shaking as I wrote down the coordinates. They marked a location deep in the Pine Barrens that I'd never visited, along a dirt road I'd never traveled. But I knew the voice was right. Somehow, I understood that I was already lost, had been lost since the first time I'd heard that impossible broadcast. The Pine Barrens doesn't just swallow people, it collects them. And somewhere in that vast forest, a radio station that doesn't exist continues to broadcast information about the missing, including those who don't yet know they'll never find their way home. I'm still driving these dark roads, still listening to that station, still taking notes on cases I'll never be able to solve. And sometimes, late at night, I hear my own voice coming through the static, calmly reporting the details of my own disappearance to someone else who's searching for answers in the endless New Jersey darkness. I'm Officer Robert Yazzie, and I've been working for the Navajo Nation Police Department for 14 years. My patrol area includes some of the most sacred and beautiful land in the Southwest, including the Slot Canyons near Page, Arizona, where thousands of tourists come every year to photograph the way light moves through carved stone. Most of my work involves routine issues, traffic violations on tribal roads, domestic disputes, the occasional drunk and disorderly case involving tourists who don't understand where they are or what this land means to my people. Antelope Canyon has always been special to the Diné. We call it Tse Bihaniling, the place where water runs through rocks. For generations, our stories have described it as a place where the boundary between worlds grows thin, where spirits of the ancestors still move through the narrow passages carved by flash floods over countless years. The Navajo Parks and Recreation Department carefully regulates access to protect both the canyon and the visitors, requiring guided tours and limiting the number of people allowed inside at any given time. The canyon consists of two main sections: Upper Antelope Canyon, known as the Crack, and Lower Antelope Canyon, called the Corkscrew. Both are slot canyons, narrow passages carved deep into the red sandstone, where walls soar hundreds of feet overhead and the floor can be so narrow that visitors must walk single file. When sunbeams pierce through the openings above, they create the ethereal light shows that have made the canyon famous among photographers worldwide. I've walked these canyons hundreds of times over the years, both on patrol and for personal reasons. My grandfather used to bring me here when I was a child, teaching me to listen to the whispers of wind through stone and to show proper respect for the spirits that inhabit sacred places. I know every turn, every chamber, every place where the walls narrow or widen, which is why I immediately recognized something was wrong when the reports started coming in. The first incident occurred in late September of 2024. A photographer from California named Jennifer Wu had been on a guided tour of Upper Antelope Canyon when she became separated from her group. According to her statement, she'd been taking pictures in one of the deeper chambers when she noticed what appeared to be a metal door set into the canyon wall, partially concealed by shadows and the natural curvature of the rock. It looked like it had always been there, she told me during the interview, like it had been carved into the stone itself. But I've been to Antelope Canyon 3 times before, and I've never seen anything like it. The door was made of some kind of dark metal with symbols or markings that I couldn't read. Jennifer claimed she'd tried to photograph the door, but her camera malfunctioned every time she pointed it in that direction. When she attempted to rejoin her tour group, she found herself alone in the canyon with no idea how to get back to the entrance. She wandered for what felt like hours before, suddenly finding herself standing outside the canyon, disoriented and unable to remember how she'd gotten out. Her tour guide, an experienced Navajo man named Thomas Begay, told a different story. According to Thomas, Jennifer had never separated from the group. She'd been with them throughout the entire 90-minute tour and had exited the canyon normally with everyone else. But the security cameras at the canyon entrance supported Jennifer's version of events. They showed her entering with the tour group, but never showed her leaving. I might have dismissed this as confusion or disorientation, common problems in the narrow, winding passages of slot canyons. But similar reports began coming in from other visitors. Always the same pattern: tourists claiming to have found a door that hadn't been there before, cameras malfunctioning when they tried to photograph it, and hours of missing time before they found themselves outside the canyon with no memory of how they'd exited. The most disturbing case involved a family from Texas parents with 2 teenage children who'd been on a photography tour of Lower Antelope Canyon. All 4 family members independently described seeing the same metal door, this time located in a chamber they'd never visited, despite having walked through that exact area multiple times during their tour. We were following our guide through the main passage, the father, Craig Morrison, told me. Then we turned a corner, and there was this room that hadn't been there before, with walls that curved up higher than I could see. And at the far end was this door, maybe 7 feet tall, made of metal that looked almost black in the light. The most unsettling part of their account was what happened when they approached the door. According to their statements, the metal surface showed their reflections, but the reflections were wrong. They showed the family members at different ages, sometimes older, sometimes younger, sometimes as people they didn't recognize at all. The mother, Linda Morrison, described seeing herself as an elderly woman in the door's reflection, then as a child, then as someone else entirely, a Navajo woman in traditional dress who stared back at her with knowing eyes. Their teenage son claimed his reflection showed him as an adult, then as a small child, then as someone who looked like him but wasn't him, wearing clothes from what might have been a different time period. Security footage from both canyon entrances showed the Morrison family entering Lower Antelope Canyon at 10:37 a.m. with their tour group, but like the previous cases, there was no record of them leaving. They appeared outside the canyon at 3:22 p.m., confused and disoriented, with no memory of the previous 4 hours. I decided to investigate personally. Working with the Navajo Parks and Recreation Department, I arranged to walk through both canyon sections during off hours when no tours were scheduled. I brought standard equipment, flashlights, radio, GPS unit, as well as traditional items my grandfather had taught me to carry in sacred places. Cedar, cornmeal, and turquoise, offerings for any spirits that might be disturbed by my investigation. Upper Antelope Canyon felt different during my solo walk. The familiar passages seemed longer than they should be, the walls higher and more imposing. I've spent countless hours in these canyons, but that morning I found myself questioning which turns led where, which chambers connected to each other. The acoustics were wrong too. My footsteps echoed in ways that didn't match the canyon's normal sound patterns. In the chamber known as Cathedral Rock, where the walls open into a wider space and light filters down from multiple openings above, I found something that shouldn't have been there. At first, it looked like a natural shadow in the rock face, just another variation in the sandstone's natural patterns. But as I moved my flashlight across the wall, the shadow resolved into something geometrical, intentional. It was a door. The metal surface was dark, almost black, set flush with the canyon wall as if it had been carved from the living rock. The craftsmanship was precise, with edges that met the stone perfectly, creating the illusion that it had always been part of the canyon structure. Symbols were etched into the metal, not Navajo, not any Native American writing I recognized, but somehow familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. I approached carefully, remembering the stories my grandfather had told about places where the world grew thin, where doors might open onto paths that led elsewhere. The metal was cold under my flashlight beam, colder than it should have been in the desert heat. As I moved closer, I began to see my reflection in its surface. But the reflection was wrong. Instead of showing me as I was a 43-year-old Navajo police officer in uniform, the metal surface showed me at different ages, as a child walking through these canyons with my grandfather. As an old man I hadn't become yet, with gray hair and lines around my eyes, and sometimes, most disturbingly, as someone who looked like me but wasn't me, wearing clothes I'd never seen, standing in places I'd never been. I tried to photograph the door with my cell phone, but the device malfunctioned every time I pointed the camera toward the metal surface. The screen would flicker, the app would crash, or the image would come out completely black despite the flashlight illumination. As I stood before the door, I began to hear something that chilled me more than the unnatural cold radiating from the metal. Voices, speaking in Navajo, coming from the other side. The words were indistinct, but the cadence was familiar. It sounded like the prayers and stories my grandfather used to recite, the old ways of speaking that connected our people to the land and to each other. But underneath those familiar voices, I heard something else. English words spoken by tourists, describing sights they shouldn't be seeing. A woman talking about photographing landscapes that didn't exist. A man discussing hiking trails that led to places not found on any map. Children laughing and playing in areas where no children had ever been. I reached toward the door handle, a simple metal loop that seemed to invite touch, but stopped when I realized what I was hearing in those distant voices. They weren't just random tourist conversations. I was hearing the specific words spoken by Jennifer Wu, by the Morrison family, by every visitor who had reported finding this impossible door. Their conversations were happening simultaneously, as if all their visits were occurring at the same moment behind that metal barrier. The implication was staggering and terrifying. The door wasn't just an entrance to somewhere else, it was an entrance to somewhere else. Every tourist who had found it, every moment of confusion and missing time, was still happening behind that metal surface. They weren't lost in space, but in time, wandering through versions of Antelope Canyon that existed in parallel to our own. I backed away from the door, my grandfather's warnings about disturbing sacred places echoing in my memory. As I retreated, I could see my reflection in the metal surface changing, showing me possible futures where I opened that door and stepped through, joining the voices on the other side, becoming part of whatever collection of moments existed in that impossible space. When I reached the canyon entrance, I found that 4 hours had passed, though my walk had felt like minutes. My radio had been silent the entire time, though dispatch later confirmed they'd been trying to reach me regularly. My GPS unit showed I'd traveled impossible distances through areas of the canyon that don't exist on any survey. I filed my report carefully, describing the door's location and appearance without mentioning the voices or the temporal anomalies I'd witnessed. The Navajo Nation Council decided to restrict access to certain areas of both canyon sections, citing concerns about geological stability and visitor safety. Official tours now avoid the deeper chambers where the door appearances have been most frequent. But the reports continue to come in. Tourists still find doors that shouldn't be there, still lose hours in passages that should take minutes to walk. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm patrolling the area around the canyons, I can hear voices carried on the desert wind, familiar voices speaking words I've heard before, describing wonders and terrors from the spaces between moments. The ancestors warned us that some places are thresholds, that certain doors open onto paths we're not meant to walk. In Antelope Canyon, those doors still stand, waiting for visitors who don't understand that some photographs capture more than light, and some journeys lead to destinations that exist outside the flow of time itself. I still patrol these canyons, but I no longer walk the deeper passages alone. Some doors are meant to remain closed, and some reflections show truths we're not ready to see.